Welcome to Brain Debate. This is a really special episode of the show because our longtime producer, Ella Coleman, is going to be hosting with me, and we're going to be interviewing Jared Millson, and both of them are at Rhodes in Memphis. You may not know this, but every single producer that has worked on the show has been at Rhodes in Memphis. So it's going to be a wonderful session talking about conspiracy theories. So, Jared, instead of a thought experiment, would you like to tell us about a real-life case?
I want to tell you two stories. One of them I expect to be pretty familiar to listeners, especially U.S. listeners. So the first is the Pizzagate conspiracy theory, as it became called. So if we go back to 2016, some may remember that Hillary Clinton's emails had been hacked and they were released by WikiLeaks. And in the aftermath of that disclosure, lots of what we call them internet sleuths started combing through those emails, especially those sent by John Podesta, who was Hillary's campaign chair at the time. And they started to see a lot of discussion of pizza, and specifically a certain pizzeria named Comet Ping Pong. And they also saw that there seemed to be like coded language being used. They also saw cases where there was a kind of pizza logo that the owner of the pizzeria had sent to some people, including, I guess, John Podesta, asking him not to share the logo. And that the logo then was, some thought, similar to certain secret codes that known pedophile rings apparently have used. There was also questions about the Instagram account for the pizzeria. They shared pictures of children apparently taped to tables in a joking manner, saying things like, ready for pizza kind of thing. But a lot of people saw this as evidence that there was a pedophile ring being run out of Comet Pizza, and that the upper echelons of the Democratic Party were involved in organizing it. This culminated, at least in one way, with in 2016, Edgar Welch, a man from North Carolina, burst into Comet Pizza and shot 3 bullets with an assault rifle. And when he was later arrested, he said that he was there to self-investigate, to find and save the children that were being held prisoner. So I think this is probably something that a lot of folks know about, something that gets called a conspiracy theory. I want to tell a different story now. And this story doesn't really have a name associated with that as a conspiracy theory, but we could call it the police state conspiracy theory. So this starts in 1970, 1971. We have in Philadelphia anti-war demonstrators organizing anti-war protests and various nonviolent demonstrations. And a group of them start to form the theory that the FBI has infiltrated their groups, that they are posing as members of the anti-war movement, that the FBI is surveilling these groups, putting taps on their phone lines, and otherwise that the FBI has been, actively involved in trying to undermine their organizational efforts. They're so convinced of this theory, that they claim the U.S. has become a police state, in precisely the sense that the police are actively surveilling and trying to disrupt the constitutionally protected activities of citizens. So convinced of this that they decide they need to break in to an FBI office and to find proof, because, as some will say, have reported, nobody would believe it, right? They were dismissed as promulgating a conspiracy theory. And so they formed the Citizens Commission to investigate the FBI, and they organized a really remarkable burglary where they broke into an FBI office in Media, Pennsylvania, and walked away with over 1,000 pages of documents. They were never caught. And they only disclosed themselves after the statute of limitations had passed. The documents showed not only that their groups, in the anti-war groups in Pennsylvania, or Philadelphia in particular, had been extensively surveilled, that their phone lines had been tapped. More importantly, it revealed a widespread activity of surveillance, and probably most notably, the program known as COINTELPRO. So listeners don't know about COINTELPRO. I'm not going to go into the details, but I definitely invite you to check it out if you don't know about it. So it stood for the counterintelligence program started by J. Edgar Hoover in the mid-50s, and it lasted until this 1971 break-in. And its mission from Hoover was to expose, disrupt, misdirect, discredit, and otherwise neutralize the activities and leaders of organizations that pose a threat to the United States. Their targets were the Communist Party, starting in the 50s, followed very soon by civil rights organizations, anti-war groups, and most of all, the Black Power movement, in particular the Black Panthers. It revealed not only that they'd been surveilling them, but that they had also engaged in political assassinations, among other things. It should be noted that another group that they targeted was the Ku Klux Klan, though much less so than the Black Power groups. What I like about these cases is that they represent people motivated by what we could call conspiracy theories, and we're going to get into that, what exactly that means, in which they are so convinced of them that they commit these criminal acts. In both cases, they're criminal acts. In the latter case, I think a lot of people would look at what was done by the Citizens Commission to investigate the FBI as a wonderful thing, and that that group would not fall under the class of conspiracy theorists that label is usually applied to in its pejorative connotation. And so some of the things I'm interested in here are what, of course, should we call conspiracy theories, and what does that label do in either promoting or dissuading people from certain activities?
Firstly, could you define what a conspiracy is and what a theory is in the sense that you're using those terms? And then more specifically, could you tell us about what criteria would make for a good theory? And does this criteria map onto conspiracy theories? So put simply, what makes for a good conspiracy theory?
I mean, this is the heart of the matter. And it is also, especially the definition problem. How do we define conspiracy theories? That is at it's the source of a rift, really, between two research programs, one in philosophy and the other in social psychology. We'll talk a little bit more about that. But starting just with the term conspiracy theory, a philosopher is going to probably approach that term and say, we need to do some good old-fashioned conceptual analysis. So that means we need to gather data in the form of intuitions, mostly linguistic intuitions, about when judgments using that term are appropriate or true, and when they're false. And then we're going to construct a theory, probably of the necessary and sufficient conditions that are required to be a conspiracy theory. And we're going to kind of, engage in a kind of reflective equilibrium, trying to modify each against the other until we have something that is a sufficiently good fit. And that is traditionally the way it's done. But another way to approach a problem is to say, well, conceptual analysis is largely beholden to intuitions. Intuitions are not always good. Even conceptual analysis admits that with reflective equilibrium, some intuitions they're outliers. They do need to be kind of culled from the data set. But conceptual engineering says, analyzing is not the only thing we can do with concepts. We can also engineer them. And we can engineer them in a way that, of course, respects some intuitions, but that achieves other ends. And typically these other ends are things like adding precision to the concept, making it possible for the concept to be used in empirical settings, right? Kind of operationalization, and also normative or moral ends. So famously, Sally Haslinger's described her approach to the concept of woman and man, gender in general, as a kind of conceptual engineering that's part of an ameliorative project, so that these terms are conceived in ways that promote certain social, political, moral ends. Now, if we approach conspiracy theory, right, we've got a choice. Which way do we go? But there's also a further choice, just to complicate things, which is when we see the term conspiracy theory, we really have a decision to make about how we're going to treat it. And one way is to treat it compositionally. That is to say that it is a linguistic expression whose meaning is derived from the meaning of its component. So in this case, the meaning of conspiracy and the meaning of theory. Most expressions are compositional in this way. In fact, it's a hallmark of language itself that it has a compositional semantic structure. But it's not the only thing we find in language. We also find idioms. These are expressions that, simply put, just don't admit of compositional analysis, like kick the bucket. You're not going to arrive at the meaning of the idiom kick the bucket by decomposing it into the meaning of its parts. So that's the first place we have to make a decision. Let's go with the conceptual analysis compositional approach, which is really the question you had asked. If we do that, we'll start with conspiracy. Conspiracy, small group of agents acting in secret to try to pull off a plan or a plot, right? That's a conspiracy. When it comes to theory, obviously that's polysemous. It has lots of different meanings. But I suspect the one that's most relevant here is a kind of explanation, right? Maybe systematic, maybe not necessarily, because we say things like, my theory is that, blah, blah, blah. It doesn't necessarily have to be systematic, but some kind of explanation of an event or an alleged event, right? Might not be something that actually happened, or a fact or an alleged fact. So we put it together and we have a conspiracy theory as an explanation of some alleged event or fact by appeal to the actions of a small group of agents acting in secret to carry out a claim. Now, if that's our definition, we can go back to our intuitions and see how well does it fit. Now, of the two cases, you'll see that I think in both cases, the theories that were being promoted by the individuals who ended up perpetrating those crimes met that definition. So Pizzagate, right? Conspiracy theory. Who's the small group acting in secret? Well, it's the pedophile ring. What are they explaining? Well, a lot of things. The positing of that conspiracy explains why certain emails look the way they do, why certain symbols are used, why there are so many children at Comet Ping Pong, maybe, which is problematic. But so explanation. And certainly what I'm calling that police state conspiracy theory that the anti-war protesters had was that, we're trying to explain why is it there's that guy who dresses like a hippie, but he's got a crew cut, those kind of things. And if we take that kind of approach, then both count as conspiracy theories. And this, I have to admit, is the predominant approach, taking that definition, the predominant approach of the philosophical community, because not universally, it's not total consensus, but it's near consensus. This is the right way to approach the definition of conspiracy theory. But notice, if we were judging by conceptual analysis, it's probably not going to look very good because, and there have now been some studies done on this, we don't use conspiracy theory in general to refer to the kind of explanation I just gave. We use it with an evaluative, specifically a pejorative connotation. And there's been some experimental work that suggests that we don't even use it to apply to things that are conspiracies. They don't even need to have conspiracies. So I'll just give you my own anecdotal evidence. I run a mock class on this topic for prospective road students, and I will start my course class at some point, at least, with I will solicit a list of conspiracy theories. And among the things that I get are things like flat Earth, Bigfoot, aliens are real, birds aren't real. You get the idea. It's basically fringe ideas, right? Views that run contrary to an official story. But the claim that the Earth is flat is not a conspiracy theory, according to the definition I just gave. It is true, however, that most folks who promulgate the flat Earth theory have some conspiracy theories in their back pocket to explain why don't most people believe this, or why are the scientists telling us what they say. So it's not as if it's unrelated. But we tend to lump in with the conspiracy thing, a lot of things that we just think are false, misguided, unwarranted, and or they kind of run against the dominant narrative. But the worry that I have, and I know other philosophers working on this have, is that we also don't call things conspiracy theories that really should be. And those are things like Watergate, Iran-Contra, the official story of 9/11, the COINTELPRO, right? We have a conspiracy theory that led people to reveal a conspiracy and show that a conspiracy theory was true, namely the COINTELPRO conspiracy. And that is one you should believe, everyone should believe, is overwhelming evidence. And so I know a lot of philosophers are concerned, and I think rightly, that when we use conspiracy theory in a way that's pejorative, that we are dissuading people, potentially at least, from investigating very real phenomena because there are conspiracies. In fact, if we go by my definition of conspiracy theory, then we are all conspiracy theorists. I take it we believe in things like Watergate, but also if you've ever told somebody about a surprise party that you planned, congratulations, you're a conspiracy theorist. Now, the problem, of course, is like that really does not jive with the way we talk, right? Like nobody's going to say, hey, I got a conspiracy theory for you. I organized a surprise party for my friend, right? People are going to be like, well, that's not a conspiracy. So this is where that decision about conceptual analysis versus conceptual engineering really comes in. How beholden is the account to the intuitions? And there, I think my reading of and I'm not a direct contributor to this debate. I've written just a little bit. I'm mostly a spectator on the philosophical debates. But there, the response has been, well, we're not really engaged in traditional conceptual analysis in the sense that we have to, as best as can, capture the ordinary intuitions revolving around that linguistic expression. Instead, we do try to meet those intuitions, but it's just as important that we achieve other ends of the concept. And those other ends would be things like precisification, but also potentially like a kind of maybe a social or moral kind of end of we shouldn't dissuade conspiracy theorists in the sense of people who are investigating potential conspiracies. That's not something that we should be suppressing or, dissuading people from doing.
So it seems that you could accept that the term conspiracy theory has this pejorative taint to it, and that it gets confused with things like the supernatural or other fringe theories. And so if we're trying to explain that neutral account of where a group of people conspire together to perform an action, to further a set of interests, maybe against others, that we need some other term for it that isn't tainted by the fringe. Or, as you say, what you want to try and do is rehabilitate the term conspiracy theory so that it's sort of expressed neutrally and doesn't necessarily imply that, everyone's wearing a tinfoil hat when they come up with a conspiracy theory. Because, as you mentioned, there are clearly cases where people conspired successfully. I wonder about this, though. So when we're trying to explain a phenomenon that's unknown to us, and we're comparing accounts, the one view is, well, people conspired together to do something different from what we were told is happening. And then there are other explanations. And so what is the best way for us to evaluate these competing explanations for why something is the case? So, for example, one of the debates that happened during COVID was, what's the source of COVID? And so you had the one view is it's a lab leak, and the other view is it comes from a wet market. Now, on its face, both of those things seemed like plausible explanations, but the one at the time was viewed as a kind of crackpot theory, like, the lab leak case was sort of seen as the kind of thing that only a tin pot person would say, and it's, there were moves to try and kind of ban that speech. Now, 5 years later, people are saying lab leak is quite a plausible account. So there's a sense in which a reaction to something that gets described as a conspiracy theory may be a very bad way of getting to the truth. And really what we want our theory to do is sort of lead us to the truth. So how do we evaluate between these different theoretical frameworks for finding out what's true?
Yeah, I think this is one of the biggest challenges in this area is sifting through and trying to get, if we can, any kind of general characteristics, telltale signs, maybe, of a theory that is unwarranted. I'll say first, I'm rather skeptical we're going to find that, or at least I'm skeptical we're going to find it in anything that maps onto, again, even our ordinary conception of conspiracy theories. Like I should say the pejorative sense. I'm not sure that those all have something bad in common. So I said I'm with the philosophers who are particularists. They think conspiracy theories, there's no reason in general to be suspicious of them. They have to be investigated on a case-by-case basis. They're warranted or unwarranted on their own merits. Okay, so, and then the other thing to say about the lab leak's a great example. So some may know that there was a paper that came out in March, I think, of 2020 called Proximal Origins of COVID-19. And it pretty much tried to establish a scientific consensus that the zoonotic explanation, that is the kind of the leap, so to speak, versus leaping from one species to another and eventually to humans, that was the much more plausible explanation, and that the lab leak was pretty much entirely implausible. We now know, thanks to a congressional inquiry, that those authors were at the time, just before writing that piece, we're talking days, they were discussing amongst themselves I'll quote one, "It's so friggin' likely," one of them said, "that this thing escaped from the Wuhan Institute of Virology." In fact, they were going so far as to buy burner phones and communicate over them. And there's also evidence that they were pressured to phrase their kind of denunciation of it in a way that was a bit more stronger than what they would have liked. Okay, so that was a really difficult case because at the time, you're right, the media was telling us, and now the scientific community was telling us, lab leak, not going to happen, not going to happen. And at the very least, it should not have been written off in the beginning. So I actually, just one thing to say about that is that I think shows the very detrimental effect that the majority of use of conspiracy theory can have. In fact, Anthony Fauci in the congressional hearing said he had to salvage this. He said the lab leak hypothesis is not a conspiracy theory, which I find interesting because, I mean, on most accounts of it actually is a conspiracy theory on a neutral definition. At the very least, if you think the Chinese government was trying to obfuscate or kind of close off information. So I think technically it is a conspiracy theory, but it's really interesting to think about what he was saying there, right? The signal he was clearly he felt he needed to. But to go back, what are the characteristics of a theory in general that make it something we should believe? Now here, I think we have to lean on the work that's been done in philosophy of science, specifically work on what are called the theoretical virtues and the explanatory virtues. So this is a kind of attempt to characterize what considerations figure in scientists' decisions to either accept one theory over another, or at least pursue a research program over another one. And here, there's no exhaustive list that I'm aware of, but there's some big ones that usually need to be considered. Among those, one is evidential fit, right? How well does it fit the evidence? How likely is the evidence given the hypothesis? And conversely, how likely is the evidence if another hypothesis is true, right? So we need what's called the statistics, the Bayes factor for our models and our theories. But we also need simple explanations. And that means we want explanations that posit fewer causes rather than more. We want theories that are coherent, both internally, logically coherent, and also fit well with already established and accepted views. And not least, we need theories that unify phenomena. That is, they explain more than their rivals, all else being equal. Now, one of the big problems is this is fundamentally an underdetermined choice about what theory to accept. Because while it's certainly the case that we could come in and say, this theory is simpler than this one, this theory is more coherent than this one, and so on, there does not seem to be a rational way of ranking these considerations such that in every context, simplicity should matter most. Evidential fit should matter most. Especially if we look at the history of science, we find that there was no consistent kind of dominant virtue. Scientists behave very differently in different cases. Sometimes one matters more than another. Some feminist philosophers of science have argued that conservativity, so that's a kind of external coherence, that is actually not a good virtue, right? That's not something that, at least in some sciences, should be pursued. That sometimes something else matters more, like evidential fit, something like that. So if we apply these to conspiracy theories, we say official story and conspiracy theory, and we try to run through this list, we're going to find that a lot of the intuitively unwarranted conspiracy theories rank pretty well, at least on some virtues. One of the characteristics, I think, of a lot of the conspiracy theories that we know about, which are, that we dismiss, right? Like the kind of global malevolent conspiracies, like the Illuminati. One of their hallmarks is this incredible unificatory power that, the Illuminati will explain everything from Jay-Z's hand gestures to why Napoleon lost at Waterloo. That is an amazing characteristic of a theory, and something that, again, all else being equal, we would want in a theory. I mean, it's one of the things that make evolution such a powerful theory is that it unifies so much phenomena. So there are things in conspiracy theories that we ultimately want to reject that are very attractive. Sometimes conspiracy theories are simpler, right? If I can explain why a certain world trade agreement was made by positing a secret cabal or the Illuminati making the decision ahead of time, that's actually simpler than saying, well, there are these competing national interests. There's this complicated negotiation that I need to model game theoretically, right? And all those different desires are different causes, right? So sometimes they're simpler. And that makes it really hard. It makes it really hard to tell when we should accept a conspiracy and when we shouldn't. And so I don't think there's an algorithm for this. I don't think there's a simple solution. But if we just approach it that way, it's really complicated. The other thing to say is it may be the case that there's no decision to be made synchronically. Another, like at a time, it's impossible to decisively favor one theory over another. Instead, we have to take time and we have to watch how the research program, we want to call it that research program, progress. So rather than judging at the beginning, lab leak, crazy, shouldn't investigate, we should investigate, see where it goes. Because if we judge these theories diachronically, we can appeal to this distinction that's the philosopher of science Lakatos gave us, which is between progressive and degenerate research programs. So progressive research programs produce theories with novel predictions. Degenerate research programs either don't produce models with novel predictions, or they do and they turn out systematically to be false or consistently false. And so over time, you can start to see this. But in the beginning, a lot of times the warranted and the unwarranted conspiracy theories look very similar. So my takeaway from this is we shouldn't be so dismissive of conspiracy theories because it's very hard to tell a lot of times. It's very hard to tell.
As you said, a virtue of theories is simplicity. We should prefer theories that are the simplest. So, for example, the general theory of relativity is more simple than the Newtonian theory, and we think the former is better. Another case is Copernicus's heliocentric model of the solar system, which is simpler than its rival, the geocentric model, even though both could explain the observed movements of celestial bodies. Conspiracy theories, however, posit things like unobserved agents, hidden motives. They assume, let's say, coordinated deception across institutions, and require additional mechanisms to explain contradictory evidence, like cover-ups, etc. So all this being said, wouldn't conspiracy theories typically fail to meet the criteria that would be used to distinguish good theories from bad ones? And thus, ought we not acknowledge an epistemic skepticism towards conspiracy theories?
So while conspiracy theories, and again, I'm using that term neutrally, but like we're focusing right now on the ones that are intuitively something we shouldn't believe. Which that's not an intuition we should trust necessarily, but the ones that intuitively we should believe or we're told we shouldn't believe, they will often score very well on some virtues, but horrible on others. And it does tend to be a trade-off. So for example, you might think evidential fit. If anything's gonna like rule the roost when it comes to the virtues, evidential fit should be it. And it is absolutely the case that some conspiracy theories about the JFK assassination explain more of the available data than the official story does. In particular, there were versions of the JFK assassination theory that explain virtually all the eyewitness testimony. And it's well known the official story doesn't explain much of it at all. And so you might think, well, surely that's got to be the most important. But then we have to remember that you don't actually want a theory that explains all the data. So what looks like a virtue becomes a vice. Too much of a good thing, right? You don't want a theory to explain all the data because some of the data is going to be noise. In the case of eyewitness testimony, a lot of that is unreliable. And so if you have an explanation for everything in the data set, then it's very likely you're explaining things that are inaccurate to begin with. So you see how there's this kind of like trade-off at a certain point where you want them to go on the virtues, but you want them to do better than others on the virtues, but not too good, right? Because you get these kind of situations. And yeah, in the case of simplicity, sometimes conspiracy theories are not simpler, like the Pizzagate one, right? Like you might just think they multiply causes unnecessarily. Okay, why are there so many kids at Comet Ping Pong Pizzeria? One theory, there's a sex pedophile ring on, organized out of it. Another one, it's pizza. There are kids, they love pizza, right? Like, of course they're gonna, and there's like games too. Like, why would there not be kids? So there it just looks like you're multiplying causes unnecessarily, because I would imagine the conspiracy theorist isn't going to deny there's actually pizza there.
Just to keep pressing you about the epistemic merit of conspiracy theories, many conspiracy theories seem to be unfalsifiable. So they're a belief or a theory that cannot be proven wrong, no matter what evidence you find. And this is kind of driven by ad hoc modifications, changes made to a theory after the fact to protect it from counter evidence. So, for example, if evidence contradicts the conspiracy theory, it can be explained away. As Plain did, for example, if experts deny the theory, you could say they're in on it. If no evidence is found, it's proof of how well the conspiracy is hidden. So no matter what evidence arises, the theory can always be adjusted to accommodate it. There's no way to test it or show that the theory is false. So conspiracy theories may seem epistemically weak in this sense because they can't provide reliable knowledge.
I mean, I think that might be one of the most common objections you hear from people who have thought about this. They're like, look, these theories are unfalsifiable. Any piece of evidence you provide the advocates of the theory, they're going to find a way to explain it, often by like ballooning the conspiracy to include the source of the counter evidence. There's a lot of things to be said here. I mean, first of all, falsification is not a sufficient criteria for science. So a scientific theory is not scientific merely because it's falsifiable. We should also first probably say what falsifiability means. And here it's actually not always clear. I think Popper is the originator of this term as far as I understand it. And I think his view was that a theory is falsifiable if you can derive from it some observation statement such that if it were true, the theory should be rejected or the theory is false. One of the problems with even, okay, I've said not a sufficient condition, that alone, right? There's all kinds of falsifiable stuff, doesn't make it a scientific claim. It's not clear that it's also necessary because it's also the case you can find parts of science that actually do look unfalsifiable. There are theories in science where it kind of looks like they might be unfalsifiable. This is actually an accusation that's been leveled at numerous research programs in sciences. Most recently, I know in cognitive science, the theory of consciousness known as integrated information theory has been accused as a pseudoscience. Actually, Ella and I, she's learning about Bayesian theories in cognitive science, and there's a charge against Bayesian theories that they're unfalsifiable because any contrary, human performance on a test can be explained by modifying the priors or the likelihood function or building in some other auxiliary assumption. So falsification, it's not clearly something that we have to have. And if we do have to have it, it's very difficult to say what is so great about that in science, but not good in the conspiracy theory world. Scientists hang on to their theories in the face of recalcitrant evidence. And thank goodness they do, right? There was quite a bit of evidence at the beginning of the 30s, 20s and 30s, where there was evidence against the theory of general relativity. And then later, when it was observed that the speed of the arms and spiral galaxies was much faster than what general relativity predicted, that was also some seriously damning counter evidence. And yet, I think we can all agree it was very good that scientists did not treat that theory as falsified. They didn't even modify the theory in response to, especially that latter one. There was no modification to general relativity. Instead, there were auxiliary assumptions that were added, ad hoc modifications, you like call them, right? But I think that's probably not fair, right? These were, plausible auxiliary hypotheses that serve to protect the core of general relativity. So you have things like dark matter hypothesis, as well as its kind of competitor, the modified Newtonian dynamic hypothesis. So, if we think, unfalsifiability, that's the problem, it's gonna be a pox on the houses of the scientists too. And I don't think we want that. And the last thing to say about that is it really right to call falsifiability a property of the theory? My attitude is that falsifiability is all about conduct. You can treat any theory as unfalsifiable if you are creative enough, imaginative enough to come up with ways to save the theory. So it's really about the kind of conduct of the individuals. Now, are promulgators of conspiracy theories more likely to act in a way that, treats their theory as unfalsifiable? Maybe. I don't know. Do they do it more so than scientists? I'm not so sure about that. And the last thing to say about this is that we want scientists to be dogged in their adherence to theories. It's actually a good thing. Now, it's not good when it's dogmatic or when there's a kind of false consensus or something like that. But we want scientists to be hanging on to their theories, even when it is the minority view. We want some renegade scientists. That is a very good thing. Not only because their theory may turn out to be true, but more importantly, they act as a check on the consensus, right? Forcing the consensus to come up with reasons to defend itself, pursue further experiments, and so on. So exactly the thing that I think a lot of people think is so bad about conspiracy theories is something that we treat as laudable. And if we don't, we should recognize that it is in science. At the very least, at the collective level, we benefit from the renegades.
So the Trump administration sent off a letter to Harvard recently where they asked for a series of concessions. One of them was viewpoint diversity. And there's been a lot of consternation about the idea that you could, force academic departments to hire people based on viewpoint diversity. And would it necessarily mean that you have to hire pseudoscientists in your science department and conspiracy theorists in your history department? And, there's sort of a view that this whole endeavor is a nuts endeavor. But as you point out, it's quite useful to have some renegades around. One of the good examples in science were those who held the view that plate tectonics was a good explanation for how the Earth formed. And it was seen as a minority view. And a department kind of persisted for a long time, partly for pernicious, selfish reasons, which is that if you're saying unusual things, you're going to get your papers published. Whereas if you're saying the mainstream thing, it's sort of more competitive and harder to get it out there. And it turns out that they were right. Now, it might very well be that if we care about finding out what's true, that being a conspiracy theorist on its own might not be a good method, that you're going to be wrong more often. But having some conspiracy theorists around forces everyone else to sort of sharpen up their views, to test it against that. And every so often, it turns out that the conspiracy theorist is right. And so you might think that having a series of competing models for explaining the truth is the best way to find out what's true, as opposed to saying this is the method and anything that falls outside the method must fall away.
Yeah, I mean, I think in general, this is the case that viewpoint diversity, in a sense, especially like in the sense of people representing different areas in a hypothesis space and that are pursuing potentially conflicting theories, that's a good thing. And I agree with that. I take it, of course, it can be kind of extreme. I don't think I want to say, oh yeah, you should hire the flat earthers in the geography department. But I'm wondering why we might say that. So one thing would be that, look, science, even among the renegades, has to abide by certain methodologies that even allow them to speak the same language, right? So if I, offer evidence for why the Earth is flat, is that I saw it in an astral projection. I don't think, even though they're putting forward a theory that is obviously a contrary theory and needs to be rebutted if it's going to be handled and addressed, I don't think that is the kind of evidence that should really be given much weight. Now, there's going to be borderline cases, right? I'm sure there's going to be situations where the evidence, is that really methodologically sound or not, even at the far reaches? That's a dicey question, and that's for scientists to decide. But there is this fundamental problem of how to incorporate renegades, how to make a space in which they're welcome to an extent. I mean, if you think about it, this is a problem not specific to science, right? This is a broad social phenomena. But in science, it bites most intensely because there does seem to be an important relationship between diversity of viewpoints and, more importantly, research programs and truth, right? It does seem to be the case when you have people pushing against one another, right, and competing for the kind of dominant, for the various incentives in science, that you do get better results when you have lots of them in, pursuing different agendas.
So could you examine the long-term viability of conspiracy theories? In other words, do conspiracy theories degrade over time? So many require that a large number of people maintain a lie. Everyone has to lie and continue to lie. And most conspiracy theories assume that lots of people keep lying for a long time. Over time, it's more likely that someone will leak the truth. People leave jobs, they fall out of loyalty, they experience guilt or a change of heart, and error just happens. So a theory that needs perfect, endless secrecy from a large amount of people seems like it would start to collapse under its own weight, maybe. And it also seems like at some point the record might get out. Though perhaps the longer the silence continues, the less plausible the theory becomes.
This is again one of those kind of maybe heuristics we can deploy when assessing a putative conspiracy theory. It's basically like, what is the probability that we'd be seeing this stuff if the conspiracy exists? And what's the probability that this kind of conspiracy would exist at all? You're absolutely right to point out. We just think about the conspiracies, at least we know about. Organizing a surprise party, that can be tricky, right? That can be tricky, but it's easier to pull off than a conspiracy, that it involves lots of people, where it has great significance and is something that other people will want to know about, right? The surprise party, the only person you're keeping it from is that one person who you're surprising. But if you're trying to keep it secret from lots of different sources, that's difficult. It's just hard to get people to work together. Like that is actually hard. And then to have them do it in secret, it's like compounding how difficult it is. And so I do think that the bigger the conspiracy is, that is, the more for reaching the suspected consequences of that conspiracy are. And the longer supposedly goes on, if there's no leaks, let's put it that way, the probability that conspiracy exists goes down. It should go down. I think that's something we should, no matter how likely you think there are to be conspiracies, and we talk about that in a second, but like, if you think there's a conspiracy and you haven't seen any leaks and it's really big, it's almost global or whatever, then as time goes on, your prior probability should be going down. Now, if you're updating on different kinds of evidence, if there are other sources of evidence other than leaks that are really compelling, that would change things. But that's something to definitely keep in mind. And if we go back to the kind of list of warranted, unwarranted conspiracy theories, we'll probably see some of that kind of difference. So like Watergate, okay, conspiracy of the president and some people in the White House. That's not nothing, but it's not a global conspiracy, right? Organized over centuries like the Illuminati. So I definitely think that's something that we can use when we're trying to assess these things. Like, how likely is that conspiracy to begin with? The problem, of course, is that you and I may legitimately differ in our prior probability assessments. That is to say, you might think the world is much more conspiratorial than I think. And honestly, if we go with a neutral definition of conspiracy, the conspiracy theory, and with it, the neutral definition of conspiracy, one thing I should say is that our definition of conspiracy that we've been discussing, it does not require nefarious intent. If that's the case, then yeah, history is riddled with conspiracies. It's riddled with conspiracies. But most of them are small, and they have local demands and proximate ends that are much more attainable than the kinds of things we tend to hear about under the label conspiracy theory. So it's not so easy to say, well, the prior probability of conspiracies is very high or very low. Well, it really depends on the size, the aims, and all that. So now when you bring that to bear, that can have effects in how you assess putative conspiracy theories. The thing to remember, though, is before those papers were released from the break-in in 71, the COINTELPRO papers, later followed by the Pentagon papers, later followed by the Watergate scheme, Americans could not concede, the majority of Americans could not concede that the FBI was doing what it was doing. There were movies and TV shows about the FBI, like everybody loved J. Edgar Hoover, apparently. Not everybody, obviously that's massive exaggeration, but the idea was like, very few people would think that this was actually happening. And so now that we know those kind of things happen, it's got to raise the prior probability of a whole bunch of otherwise seemingly implausible conspiracies. And note also, just to go back to the lab leak case, there is a conspiracy theory that the authors of Proximal Origin were pressured to downplay the plausibility of the lab leak hypothesis. And it really does look like that was happening, whether it was Fauci or other things. It does look like they were pressured, and that's conspiracy theory, right? That's people working in secret to kind of suppress this information. It's hard not to think, that's at least plausible. Or it's possible, and I think it's probably more likely than not given the evidence, though I'm not an expert on this. So once these bigger conspiracies have been revealed, as they have in the 20th century, I think it kind of makes sense that we would start looking for them elsewhere. And that complicates matters, because it is going to raise the prior probability for even the bigger ones, maybe not Illuminati, but the bigger ones.
So you might think that there's something comforting about a conspiracy theory, that the idea that there are a small group of people who run everything, who are behind, all the big incidents in the world, kind of implies like there is a plan, as opposed to there is just a lot of chaos. And if I think about one of the big conspiracy theories around COVID was that you had some small cabal of people who agreed, we are going to institute lockdowns across the planet. and maybe for some nefarious purpose, right? So they knew the disease was heading its way, and they all spoke to each other, and all the government had said, we're going to institute lockdowns and not let people leave their houses. So that's one way to read what occurs. The other one is to think maybe people are more like a flock of birds, that there isn't a leader. But what you have is that the birds look left and right, and they sort of follow a path, but there is no pre-plan. There is no one who is designing anything. It's just that people moderate their conduct accordingly based on the observed environment. And so the idea that, well, we started with lockdowns in China, other countries seem to follow suit. It seems like everybody's doing it. I guess we should do this too. That seems quite common for human beings. There's a famous study done about seeing how you could get people to use energy efficient light bulbs, and they sent people different leaflets, and the one said, like, the planet is dying, energy efficient light bulbs will save our planet. Other one said you will save a whole bunch of money. One of them said your neighbors are all using energy efficient light bulbs, and one of them was a sort of like placebo, just to sort of check how people reacted. Turns out the one that had the best influence was your neighbors are doing this, and that most people weren't compelled by the sort of higher ideals of money or the planet. They just want to kind of do what everyone else is doing. They don't want to be too much of an outlier. And that's, if we're trying to have explanatory force for, what's the most likely explanation, having a good sense of what human nature is like seems like a good start. And also, as Ella points out, human nature is such that people don't keep secrets very well. That it's quite easy for leaks to occur. If we think about something like the moon theory was faked as a conspiracy theory, this requires an enormous number of people to keep a secret for decades and decades, and it might very well be a plausible thing to think at the time. I mean, it's so unusual, for people to sort of arrive at the moon, and you have political reasons for why the Americans needed to beat the Russians, that it wasn't a totally outlandish thing to say, well, maybe this was faked. But as time progresses, we have reasons to think, well, this is a less likely candidate, knowing that we have the technology to send people to space, and knowing that we could have had the tech at the time, all that sort of stuff leads us to sort of change our minds, even if there was some plausibility at the time.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, so your initial point really highlights these kind of two poles on the spectrum, kind of coincidence, or we could better call it like invisible hand explanations versus hidden hand explanations, right? So societies are massively complex systems, and it's very hard to understand why anything happens in them. It is absolutely easier to explain it by pointing to a small group that has a lot of power, that works in secret and pulls off a plan. It is also, I think you alluded to this, there's a kind of sense of satisfaction in that, because it explains something that you might not otherwise have an explanation for. Or if you do have an explanation for it, it has to do with very complicated social dynamics and things that are happening below the level of anybody's intentions, right? Like nobody's trying to pull this off, but it just happens. Shit happens, right? Like it does. And so there is a kind of comfort, and I know there's some psychological research on this, that, I mean, like we're explanation seeking creatures, right? It's thank goodness too, right? Like thank you evolution, like we want explanations, we want to find causes, and that's really good. But maybe that's explaining this preference for conspiracies. There's also what's called the fundamental attribution error, which is that when it comes to events and actions of individuals, we tend to treat them as the product of dispositional forces, that is to say, their attitudes, their character, rather than situational ones. That is the context, right? And so you could see why conspiracy theories really fall into that kind of attribution error, if it's an error, right? I mean, we definitely tend to prefer the dispositional ones. And so that may be why we often gravitate to the conspiracy theory over the coincidentalist, or the hidden hand versus the invisible hand one. The other thing to say about that is conspiracy theorizing is a communal enterprise. Very few people are doing this on their own. There's whole sub-communities, subcultures and communities that have arisen, especially on the internet, Reddit, so on, that when you see this, I have to say, like, I have an amazing, what Matthew Dennett calls improvised expertise, right? That, like, if you think about the 9/11 inside job explanation, that requires knowledge that basically nobody alone has. you needed to know a lot of things, be familiar with international politics, and also civil engineering and structural engineering. And almost nobody's in that position. In fact, the commission that the U.S. government eventually, opened and then investigated in 9/11 had people for all these different areas. And so this is also another reason why I think conspiracy theories, you see more of them maybe in modernity, which is that knowledge is hyper specialized. There's so much we don't know because there's so much that's known, right? Nobody knows how to, make a computer mouse from the raw materials all the way to the functional thing. There's no one person. I've heard that claim before. Whether it's true or not, the point is it illustrates the kind of radical division of social knowledge. And consequently, it makes sense that when you have an event that requires integration across various domains, it's going to be hard. And you're not going to find maybe somebody that can, or even a group of people that can explain it readily. But you have people who are working with what they know, and admittedly, a lot of it is amateurish, trying to cobble together the best explanation they can. But maybe one of the reasons you find these where you do is because they lie at these points of intersection among their various specialized knowledge communities where you don't have enough integration across them to have ready explanations for these events. And then also you've got people, in these communities, there's worries about echo chambers and things like that, reinforcement. But I tend not to see that as something in any way unique to conspiracy theorists. Again, this is the kind of pejorative sense of conspiracy theory. I guess I'm using here the kind of crank, the outlandish fringe thinker. There's this, I think I should say, social psychologists have treated that kind of conspiracy theories and conspiracy theorizing as pathological. That these are problems, that there's a certain kind of conspiratorial mindset that predisposes individuals to believing conspiracy theories, and that it is fundamentally irrational. And this is really problematic. You'll notice it runs completely contrary to the philosophical virtual consensus, which is that conspiracy theory should be thought of neutrally, not pejoratively. The social psychologists think the complete opposite. It is, by definition, in most of their cases, irrational to believe conspiracy. And then they want to go out and find out how many people believe it. And I know it mentioned there's this survey that's done by social psychologists. It's called the generic conspiratorial belief scale. I'll just give you an example of some of the questions that get asked. Now, you're asked to score it from 1 to 5 on a Likert scale, 1 being not likely to be true, 5 being very likely to be true. And so you've got questions like, the government is involved in the murder of innocent civilians and or well-known public figures and keeps this a secret. The government permits and perpetrates acts of terrorism on its own soil, disguising its involvement. A small secret group of people is responsible for making all major world decisions, such as going to war. Secret organizations communicate. Then it gets a little more outlandish, and it starts incorporating extraterrestrials and aliens. One of the problems you may think here is that if this is being used to identify the extent of conspiratorial thinking, conceived as a pathology, right? Then you've got questions on here that I think most people, there's at least some that you should be giving 5s to. I mean, that first one, the government is involved in the murder of innocent civilians. I think we just already talked about how that is absolutely true. Of course, it also depends what government, right? But if you're in the US, it is absolutely true. And so there's a worry, I think, among a lot of philosophers that this pathologizing of conspiracy theory is going to exacerbate this problem of labeling things conspiracy theories and dissuading people from investigating theories that, like you said, sometimes turn out to be true.
So returning to the idea of control that Mark raised, maybe an ethical concern of conspiracy theories could have to do with apathy. So conspiracy theories might foster a sense of apathy or fatalism. If they, a more powerful group controls everything, then ordinary citizens may feel that nothing they do matters. So if a person comes to believe that a powerful hidden group controls world events, whether it's a secret society, global elites, etc., they may conclude that individual or collective efforts are futile. And this could be a direct threat to civic responsibility. So instead of responding to problems with action or cooperation, believers may retreat into something like suspicion or disengagement or even aggression. And democratic societies rely on the assumption that individuals can participate in shaping their collective future through things like voting, organizing, advocating, and holding institutions accountable. So therefore, while conspiracy theories may appear to restore control, they actually erode collective norms that are essential to a responsible society.
I can totally see that would be a kind of result of conspiracy, or it could have that effect. I have to admit, like, my initial impulse is to say it's quite the opposite, that it offers a kind of simple fix to very complex problems. If you think about it, it's a lot easier if it's just a small group of people controlling everything than if this is the product of unintended consequences of massively complex systems that it is incredibly difficult to intervene upon and to figure out what the kind of intervention should be. Which I take is just like the problem of policy in general. Like, we want these certain things, but we have no idea how to bring it about. That's much more daunting, I would think, than, hey, it's these people. And so, like, at the very least, we can ascribe responsibility. There's comfort there. It's a kind of control in the sense of, like, we have a target, maybe, or we know what needs to be fixed. But you're right to point out, if you think that the global cabal is so powerful that no matter what you do, it will have no effect and they'll still control it, then yeah, it does make sense that it would lead to apathy and kind of resignation. It would be an interesting question to see if you find people who believe some of these more global malevolent theories, if they're more or less politically active. I suspect a lot of them will be involved in, like, on the ground conspiracy theory inquiring, right? Like, they're investigating conspiracy theories. Is that a kind of political activism? I mean, I give you the example of the Citizens Commission to investigate the FBI. That looks like citizens doing exactly what they should be doing, holding authorities accountable, engaging in investigation. Now, I'm not endorsing their breaking into the FBI office, but the idea of citizens investigating, that seems to be something. I guess I wonder if that's kind of counter instance. So, like, here we have a conspiracy theory that motivated these people to undertake a kind of richly democratic activity. But I admit, I think I could see it going the other way. I suppose it would be a really interesting empirical question to see what the relationship is. And I suspect there are some folks who have actually looked at this, but that's really cool.
Well, Jared, this has been an absolutely fascinating conversation. One of the things that we pride ourselves on doing on the show is to sort of have a variety of different views, and having someone sort of punt for why conspiracy theories aren't as bad as you think they are really fits in with the vibe of the show. So we look forward to having you back sometime soon. And in the comments, please let us know what your favorite conspiracy theory is. If you want to send us a message on Spotify with a voice note or with a message on YouTube, we look forward to hearing it. Cool. I'm going to stop our recording. That was great.